common question that people ask is, okay, you say that Newton was working in science, we know that, and you also say that he was working in theology. What is the relationship, if any, between those spheres? Now, a very common conception today is that science and religion are not connected. There is a wall between them. And there are various types of people who'd want to say that, but certainly people with a more of a secular view, maybe don't like religion, want to suggest that science isn't associated with religion because they think that maybe religious thinking might contaminate science. Well, as we'll see, for Newton, the two are bound up together. He does not believe that they're separated. William Blake is one of the leading figures of the Romantic movement, Romantic with a capital R. And he reacted rather negatively to Newton. And he did this, I would argue, largely on the basis of misinformation about Newton. Newton was interpreted by the Enlightenment, in particular the French Enlightenment, as a kind of cold, calculating person who wasn't really interested in spiritual things. And you can see that emblematized in this painting right here. This is not what Newton looked like. He didn't have that kind of physique. He didn't have tight, curly, blonde hair. So it's an allegorical Newton. But you can see when you look at this image that this is a cold, calculating rationalist. He's not looking up to heaven where God is. He's looking down to a geometrical diagram. So this is a very common depiction of Newton, that he wasn't spiritual, he was a rationalist, he was only interested in mathematics, and God was perhaps in his worldview, but rather distant. And we get this idea of a clockwork universe, that Newton invents a clockwork universe where God creates the universe like a clock, winds it up, and then goes on a holiday. It's a very common association with Newton, that Newton goes with the clockwork universe. We'll come back to that a little later, but I will show you that Newton did not believe in a clockwork universe. In fact, he was opposed to it. So we're not going to talk about Newton, the scientist. In fact, Newton was not a scientist. I don't want to shock anyone. Newton could not have been a scientist. There's a rather pedantic reason for that. The term scientist wasn't even coined until 1833, but more importantly, the role didn't exist. Rather, Newton was a natural philosopher, a philosopher of nature. And that very title suggests that the humanities and the sciences came together in that discipline in a way that they often don't today, unfortunately. So Newton wasn't a scientist in the modern sense. He wasn't a scientist, with the white lab coat. That's a modern role. Newton was instead more like a Renaissance man. He was working in various different fields, and those fields included physics as well as theology. So we're going to talk about Newton as a theologian. He's able to use terms like natural philosophy and religion and God, etc. So he's able to use the language, but if you look at the way he works, he combines these ideas together. And the testimony of the manuscripts shows us this. Newton, as with many natural philosophers in the early modern period, believed that if you studied nature, you were studying the works of God. And one of the main reasons why they believe this is because the Bible confirms this. So if you look at this passage from Psalm 104, O Lord, how manifold are thy works, and wisdom thou hast made them all. The earth is full of thy riches. People like Newton, looking at passages like this, it confirmed their belief that when they studied nature, when they studied the cosmos, they were studying the handiwork of God. So to work in what we would now call science was, in effect, an act of devotion at the same time. Now, in addition to that, Newton looked at passages like Psalm 104, but also, more importantly, Psalm 119, which begins with a statement about the glory of the heavens. They would, Newton and those of like mind, would look at passages like that, which tell us that the heavens are declaring the glory of God. The firmament showeth his handiwork, etc., etc. So when you're looking at the heavens, God is speaking to you through the beauty and the design of nature. So again, what this meant for Newton and for others like him in the 17th and 18th century, Robert Boyle, who's one of the founders of modern chemistry, is another example, is that when they're studying nature, they're studying creation. And so this connects the study of nature with their religion. I'll give you an example of this. This is a manuscript which is now at the University of Cambridge. As you can see, this one also has suffered some kind of burning. But there's a little phrase up here in Latin that he added to a paragraph. And I'm going to come back to this a little bit later. In a manuscript that talks about God and time and space. It's a very, very profound manuscript. What is that little bit that he added? Well, here it is right here. Deus ex operibus cognoscitur. God is known from his works. Now, there are two things I want to say about this. First of all, this is an example of what is called natural theology. So in the early modern period, there were people like Newton who believed that, as I said, if you study nature, you could see the work of God in nature. So this is called natural theology. And it's related to what we now call the design argument. You can see design in nature, and that implies that there is a designer with a capital D, whom we call God. That's the first point. The second point is that this process of inferring God from nature is what we call inductivism. It's empiricism. And it's the same method that he used in science, right? So when he's developing his theory of gravity, what is he doing? He's looking at examples of the motions of planets and comets. He takes all that messy data and he brings it all together and he infers a general principle from that. And that principle is the inverse square law. So you can see that he's using this inductive method in both his study of the Bible, his study of nature with respect to natural theology, and his science. So methodologically, we see linkages between different areas of Newton's work. This is a much more complicated statement, so I'll explain it a little bit after I've read it. This is also at Cambridge University Library. This is a manuscript that relates to his optics. He did add some theological notes in later editions of the optics. Metaphysical arguments are intricate and understood by few. Newton didn't like metaphysics. Metaphysical arguments are intricate and understood by few. Newton didn't like metaphysics. The argument which all men are capable of understanding and by which the belief of a deity has hitherto subsisted in the world is taken from the phenomena. This again is inductivism. We see the effects of a deity in the creation and thence gather the cause and therefore the proof of a deity and what are his properties belongs to. He first wrote natural, crossed that out, and then wrote experimental philosophy. 'Tis the business of this philosophy, and he's essentially talking about science there, to argue from the effects to their causes till we come at the first cause, and not to argue from any cause to the effect till the cause as to its being and quality is sufficiently discovered. So what he's saying here is that the way that you proceed if you want to understand God from nature is you study nature and then you infer the wisdom and the glory of God from nature. So again, it's an inductive process. It's the same process that he uses to discover the inverse square law and the three laws of motion, as well, of course, as his understanding of light in his optical experiments. And by the way, there is a legend out there that Newton only turned to theology late in his life, after he wrote the Principia, after he wrote the Optics. And this legend goes right back to the early 19th century rather. And the motivation behind it is to kind of erect a wall around his science so that the theology doesn't have anything to do with it. But also to argue that, well, that's what you do when you're older, you're soft, you know, in your dotage, you turn to theology. Unfortunately for that argument, and fortunately for historical truth, we have the manuscripts, and we see that much of Newton's best theology predates the Principia, which was published in 1687. Much of his best work in theology and much of his best work in science was done when he was young, which is what we would expect. So that is a myth. This is the manuscript that we refer to as Tempus et Locus. It doesn't actually have a title, but we give it this term. Tempus et Locus means time and space. Newton was very interested in space from the point of view of his physics, but he was also interested in space from the point of view of his understanding of God's omnipresence. So here again you can see how his science and religion come together. So he writes a series of points or questions in this manuscript. They're originally written in Latin. These are English translations of those notes. That the substance of God is not present in all places, or that the Jews more correctly called God place, makom. By the way, hope you're not too shocked by this, that is a spelling mistake in Hebrew. That's how you spell makom. So he spelled it with a kaf, not with a kof and the vav there. That is even Newton made spelling mistakes. That is a substance essential to all places in which we are placed, and as the apostle says, in which we live and move and have our being. That is an allusion to Acts 17 and 28. Is it more agreeable to reason that God's eternity should be all at once, totum symbol, snapshot view of eternity, or that his duration is more correctly designated by the names Jehovah? And then he does something very interesting. He takes this expression, ho-on, kai, ho-ein, kai, ho-erkomenos, which is in Revelation 1 verse 8, he who is and who was and is to come, and he makes it one word. He just joins it all together as a title of God. He's interested in the titles of God, the names of God, and what they might tell about his being. And what he believes is that God is present throughout all eternity, almost as if God sort of fills time. So he has a very high view of God. Now, one of the last things I want to talk about is the appendix that Newton added to the Principia. When Newton first published the Principia in 1687, it had one reference to God and one reference to the Bible. This is the 1687 edition. When he published the second edition in 1713, he added an appendix. It's about 1,450 words in the Latin. Yes, I did count the words. In the first edition, and then the second edition is a little bit longer because he added to it. And this is a draft of this text. He called it the General Scholium. And 58% of this text, the middle section, is pure theology. What is it doing there? This is one of the published versions of that text. Well, what I did is I took the text in English and put it into Wordle, and this is what came out. Can anyone see what the dominant theme of the General Scholium is? God. And yes, he does believe in one God, and there's an allusion to one God. You can see also that he's talking about planets, etc., etc. So, he begins the theological section. After talking about the solar system, he says, this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. And if the fixed stars are the centers of other like systems, these being formed by the likewise counsel must be subject to the dominion of one, and he meant that in a non-Trinitarian sense, not a three-in-one God, but the Father only, especially since the light of the fixed stars is of the same nature with the light of the sun, and from every system light passes into all other systems. Here we see how Newton's very strict version of monotheism relates to his physics, because he believes if you have one God who creates everything, you're going to have a unified solar system, you're going to have a unified cosmos, the laws of nature are going to be the same everywhere. Whereas in a polytheistic system, you might expect that, you have a God who is a god of a certain bailiwick, a principality, who has his own laws and that sort of thing. So you can see how the monotheism relates to his physics and his understanding of gravitation. One of his followers produced this chart showing the beautiful system that he describes, the comets and the planets, and there's an English translation of the text we just looked at. And then he goes on, he does something that many people found quite peculiar. He talks about the nature of this God, and he describes him as a God of absolute dominion, and he begins to use biblical language, the God of Israel, the God of gods, the Lord of lords, etc. In it. Now, I mentioned the Clockwork Universe. I want to now debunk Wikipedia, if that's okay with everyone. This text, by the way, doesn't read this way anymore because one of my colleagues, a group of his students, corrected Wikipedia. But essentially, this reference to the Clockwork Universe used to say that Newton invents the Clockwork Universe. In fact, he doesn't. And I'm going to show you a statement made by one of his followers. The notion of the world's being a great machine going on without the interposition of God as a clock continues to go without the assistance of a clockmaker is the notion of materialism and fate, and tends under pretense of making God a supramundane intelligence to exclude providence and God's government and reality out of the world. So his worry is that if you take this view of the Clockwork Universe, the idea that God creates or makes a clock, winds it up, and then takes away his hands and goes on a holiday, that this is not the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible is continuously sovereign at all times, doesn't go on a holiday, is superintending, even though he gives us free will, everything that happens in the domain of his sovereignty. So the Newtonians, Newton and his immediate followers, reject the Clockwork Universe, yet ironically it's associated with his name. At the end of the Optics, as he did with the Principia, he includes some theological notes. And this is very interesting. And one of the things he says is that if natural philosophy, that is to say science in all its parts, by pursuing this method, the inductive method, shall at length be perfected, the bounds of moral philosophy will also be enlarged. For so far as we know by natural philosophy what is the first cause, what power he has over us, and what benefits we receive from him, so far our duty towards him as well as that towards one another will appear to us by the light of nature. What is he referring to there? He's referring to what Jesus in the New Testament calls the two greatest commandments, loving God and loving neighbor. So what he's saying is that science should have an ethical center. Right? So people who say that science shouldn't have anything to do with ethics, it's completely separate from ethics. Well, Newton didn't agree with that. He believed that that love, ultimately love of neighbor and love of God, should be part of science. Richard Bentley wrote to Newton a few years after the Principia was published to help him with a series of lectures that he was revising for publication that were going to include the design argument. Now remember, the design argument is the idea that you look at nature, you see design, and you infer, again that's inductivism, you infer from design that there is a designer with a capital D. So Newton wrote back to him and he said, "Dear Richard Bentley, when I wrote my treatise about our system, that's the Principia, I had an eye upon on such principles as might work with considering men for the belief of a deity, and nothing can rejoice me more than to find it useful for that purpose. The diurnal, that is to say daily rotations of the sun and the planets, as they could hardly arise from any cause purely mechanical," he believes God is involved, "they seem to make up that harmony in the system which was the effect of choice rather than of chance." So what he's saying is that when he wrote the Principia, he was hoping that people would see in it further evidence for the creative hand of God at work, further evidence of design. And Newton, again, believes, in addition to that, that the same methods that one uses in studying the Bible and studying the frame of the world, as he uses the term right here, that you use the same methods. Why? Because he believes that God ultimately reveals himself in two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. You remember we mentioned Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. That for Newton is, and for many others in his time, is the book of nature. Now, if God does reveal himself in both those ways, and the revelation of the book of nature, of course, is very general, it's not specific, doesn't give us, detailed understanding of the atonement and that sort of thing. But if that is the case, Newton believed that is the case, then these two spheres are not going to contradict, because God is the God of order and not confusion. So therefore, there should be harmony between the book of nature and the book of Scripture, that is to say, between science and religion. If there is a conflict, that conflict arises because of our erroneous interpretation of either the Scripture or the of nature, that is to say, in science. And he says the principle of God the Creator, Newton says, should be and is for him a part, in fact, the central part, the central goal of science. So